My name's Lauryn Chun. I'm the founder of Mother-in-Law's Kimchi. I think that we all have these kind of profound memories of our childhood, whether it's like your first taste of chocolate or grilled cheese sandwiches or whatever those kind of foods were. I mean, for me, I was born in Seoul, Korea, and making kimchi with my grandmother and this kimjang, which is a fall kimchi harvest where you make a lot of kimchi with a lot of your neighbors and your family. And it's like this kimchi block party. Being like 5 years old and watching all the adults and the ladies and my grandmother and making this festive occasion to make a lot of just giant hundreds of pounds of kimchi. That memory in itself became such a huge part of when I decided to create my own company and sell mother-in-laws with the kimchi recipe that comes from my mother's restaurant. It's a unique part of my history and my personal history. And that food memory has really been part of me that I didn't realize for the longest time until I started making kimchi on my own for the first time and starting this kimchi company.
So I am so excited to talk to you today about kimchi. And in particular, I'm really excited to talk about your book. So in your book, the Kimchi Cookbook, 60 Modern and Traditional Ways to Make and Cook Kimchi, you talk about your childhood memories relating to kimchi. And I was wondering if you could talk about those memories and how they influenced you to be where you are today.
I really think that what your earliest memories as a child, really can have great impact on your future self that you don't know about, but that has such a great implication for your uniqueness and what makes you special. So to me, having that kimchi memory, I didn't know at the time until I started the company, it became a very unique qualification for me as an expert in kimchi and being able to write the cookbook on kimchi as well.
One of the things that struck me about your book is the wide diversity of kimchi recipes. How do kimchi recipes differ from each other in Korea?
Any culinary history, it has so much to do with the geography, the topography, and the climate of the people. So in the southern part of Korea, it's a peninsula. In the southern part where it's warmer, you just have a lot of kind of more spices and a lot of other kind of traditions to help preserve the food. And then as you go further north and the climate gets cooler, there's less spice, there's less pungency. Same thing with the kimchi recipes or the style, just like cooking. It really has a lot to do with the climate. And then kimchi recipe is something that's so personal that it kind of gets handed down by each generation, and each family has their own recipe. On a broad stroke, there's like 300, foundational recipes of kimchi. Then all these families then have their own. So it's just, there's no like one kimchi recipe that's the same. Everyone has their own kind of family recipe.
Your book is organized by seasons. Why did you choose to organize the book by seasons?
Kimchi is more of a method than just a recipe. So it's a method of preserving. And so you're preserving with whatever vegetables you have in season, because, back before there was, modern refrigeration where you could keep things for a long time, you had to pick your fresh vegetables and figure out a way to preserve them. In the winter vegetables, you might want to preserve for the winter months because you're not going to have any vegetables during the winter time. So you'll have these recipes that really kind of call for, how do I preserve this vegetable for 3 to 4 months as opposed to 2 or 3 days, in the summer and in the spring where there's plentiful vegetables and they're also tender, so you don't even need to preserve it for that long. So it's really a preservation type of method and so I think the seasonality of the vegetable is very important. But I know that so much of our modern lives are we have access to every vegetable year round, but, we were sort of not meant to be that way. And so it's a real kind of celebration of time and seasonality.
Going off of that and talking about seasonality, what vegetables are traditionally used in kimchi in various seasons?
So I'd say that if we kind of start from, I'll just say fall, winter, just because I think the most popular one and the one that everyone used to ask me when I would go to the farmer's market early, when I would was starting out with kimchi, and I'd have different vegetables, like whether it was, turnip or radishes or cucumbers, and people would always point and be like, oh, that's the kimchi, right? And people didn't really understand that there were other vegetables that you can make kimchi with. But of course, the most famous vegetable is the Napa cabbage. I mean, it can be grown year round, but it's in season, and the best harvest is in the fall and just before winter, before it really starts to get too cold. But again, that's not the only vegetable you can make kimchi with. It just happens to be the most popular one, especially for preserving over the winter months. But you can make kimchi with daikon radish, which is also a very, very popular one in Korea that I think a lot of people don't know about, and there's like little ponytail radishes in Korea, which is very, very traditional. You don't really see them here in the market so much, but it's a Korean variety. It just looks like it's a firmer kind of, it looks like a little daikon radish, but with a lot of radish tops and leaves. And like, I mean, I think in the spring and summer, you have cucumbers and things like scallions that you can make kimchi with. The imagination and the varieties are limitless. I think in the cookbook, I took little French radishes that are, very tender and in season in the spring to make this kind of adaptation of the traditional radish, kimchi that you make. So it's really fun when you can really be imaginative.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned a couple times thinking about how tender a vegetable is. What are qualities that you need to consider when thinking about like the length of fermentation?
The salting, and there's different method of salting for brining. So you could have a wet brine, which is in liquid, or versus a dry brine, which is a directly salting the vegetable directly on. And so each of those methods have a different result. So I think if I was working on a very tender vegetable, like I said, like maybe it's cucumbers, or maybe it's something that has a lot of water content, but that's, grows very quickly in the spring and summer. So even scallions or something like that, little kind of radishes, I would, probably use a direct salt, just putting dry brine salt, because it just probably need anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour for it to start wilting. Preparing the vegetable for seasonings, and also for as a catalyst for fermentation. And then if you have more like a hardier vegetable in the fall, so say like a daikon radish, which is like, it's like the size of a squash and is very, very firm, or Napa cabbage that's in halves, that's very, again, like a big piece of vegetable, then I would probably try to do a wet brine, which is, you want to submerge it in a salty water, and
Mhm.
and then you probably brine that overnight, or 12, 14 hours or something, and that's a much slower process. But the bigger the kind of the density of the vegetable, it kind of absorbs a slower salt. And ultimately, that type of brining really is great for long-term fermentation. So say something that you want to brine over for, 3, 6 months, whatever. And there's no end date for fermentation. It's just a kind of a continuous process. So there's really things have a different result, but depending on what kind of vegetables you're using and what kind of fermentation that you're trying to achieve.
In addition to the actual type of vegetable, I've learned from your book that the way in which you cut the vegetables or prepare them can also have a big impact
Right.
on the fermentation process. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about different ways in which traditionally they have been cut and then how that affects the fermentation?
In Korea, they don't really even like to chop vegetables all that much. Keeping vegetables whole really kind of has a slower, steadier fermentation that really develops more kind of fermented flavors. So you can kind of control that better. But once if I take a daikon radish and I start to slice it into like thin cuts, or the same thing with cucumbers, if I take a whole cucumber and cut it in half and then preserve it that way, like ferment it that way, versus cutting it into little slices, has just a very different aspect of the end result of fermentation, because it will ferment faster and quicker the more shredded, more cuts I make into the vegetable, as opposed to keep it in whole pieces. It just takes longer to kind of to develop fermentation. And how you cut it, Depends, on how quickly you want to eat it, how fermented you want it to be. But generally, as a rule, traditional kimchi making is really about trying to keep the vegetables in whole pieces and doing less of the cutting and more of the fermenting through whole pieces of vegetable, because you truly get the flavor and the deep flavors of fermentation by keeping vegetables whole and allowing it to ferment slowly.
So generally speaking, a longer, slower fermentation will have kind of deeper and more robust flavors.
Definitely, yes.
Speaking of flavor, what do you think are the essentials in seasoning? I know there can be lots of different varieties and different recipes, but for you, what do you think are the most important ingredients?
Probably at a very basic, I'd say garlic, ginger, the chili flakes, the gochujang that is from basically the Holland red pepper that's dried is one of the most important aspects of a red kimchi. And it tends to be not so much spicy, but like more like fruity and earthy, which really gives it a nice kind of aspect, especially during fermentation. But you have to remember that also not all kimchi has to have chili flakes. So up until the 17th century, Koreans didn't have access to chili flakes. It only came through vis-a-vis the idea that it came from the Portuguese who went to Japan, and then through Japan kind of made its way to Korea. So up until the 17th century, a lot of the kimchi was just a plain, brine, salted radish. And most people think kimchi has to be red and has to have spice, and that's not true, because in northern, especially the northern parts of Korea, many of the oldest kimchi recipes do not have any gochujang or red chili flakes in it. In the South, you would also put more shrimp paste or these kind of salted fermented shrimp because it was very readily accessible. In the North, you might put a little bit of beef broth, anything that from your pantry that you want to add more flavor to your seasoning. And then there's fish sauce that also comes into play from the South, and from the coastal areas of Korea, where you just had, this kind of fish sauce. So all of these things kind of play a role in the part of the fermentation process and really giving it that kind of umami flavor through fermentation. It's part of kind of the history of the region that you would put whatever kind of flavor enhancers in your pantry item to make a special sauce.
How do you balance traditional and modern recipes? And I feel like that's a kind of personal question, but in terms of like even with your book and how you prepare kimchi, like, are there core essentials that you feel like your kimchi must have, or a method that you must do, or like a mindset you must be in? And then where are places where you feel like, oh, I might be able to tinker with this or customize this?
Yeah, great question. I think that again, it kind of goes back to the way that I think about kimchi. It's an action, it's a verb, it's modern, it should be evolving. As long as you're doing the natural fermentation through that salting brining process, I think you can just make up your own kimchi recipe. And sometimes you might want to throw in some honey, you might want to throw in some plum sauce, like you might want to throw in what you think might make it more flavorful, because the traditional type would be fish sauce with seafood and all these things. I think where the part where I'm just like, you can't add that to kimchi would be like, you can't add vinegar and then call it kimchi, because that stops natural fermentation. And that's, you're already introducing a commercial grade like pH vinegar, because what kimchi is in essence is that it's making its own natural vinegar. So it's bringing the safety of your food by creating its own natural pH and making it safe to eat, the lactobacillus, which really creates the healthy gut bacteria and is kind of fighting all of the bad bacteria that can make you sick. So I think that's my number one move. Is like anytime you add vinegar, you cannot call that kimchi, because you stopped it from becoming kimchi. Sort of now
Hmm.
vinegar in there. So it was really interesting because when I first started, people would ask, "Oh, how much vinegar did you put in there?" And I said, "No, I didn't add any." What the magic of kimchi is that it creates its own vinegar. So that's you get that like sour kind of tangy flavor, but it's so pleasant because it's naturally fermented.
Hmm. So I think kimchi is probably the most internationally known Korean food, but there are so many other fermented foods. And I was hoping you could maybe just talk about a few that either you personally really enjoy or you feel like others would be curious to know about.
Absolutely. I think the backbone of Korean food is fermented flavors. And so when we created the gochujang after the kimchi, that is also another kind of fermented sauce. And the word jang is really means fermented sauce or fermented condiment. And so in a Korean household, traditionally you would see that there would be kimchi that would be, in the backyard, that would be, especially in the winter, that'd be fermenting. But then the idea of the chang is all fermented. And so there's kanjang, which is a soy sauce. And so that you would make with the soybeans and whatnot. And then you would make these kind of bricks with the soybeans that would then also become part of making the gochujang, which is the fermented kind of soybeans with chili powder that you mix together and make into a red chili paste. And then you'd also make doenjang, which is also part of the roasted soybean bricks that then you would make this kind of miso type of, soybean paste. And for me growing up, of all the changs, like probably my favorite was doenjang because I just love that taste of the fermented soybean so much.
Mhm.
So those are really the other parts of the fermented flavors that are really the basis and foundation for so much Korean food and pantry items.
Mhm. So you've shared that your first kimchi, which was launched in 2009, was an original recipe from your mother's restaurant. What was so special about that original recipe?
For me, living in New York for those 20 years and visiting my mom in California and going to the restaurant, she'd always pack up the special kimchi for me to take in my luggage. And so it became just a symbol of love. But the recipe that made that so special is also that her restaurant, which specialized in salangtang, which is this special beef bone broth soup. And this kimchi had to be really, really good because the only thing that comes to accompany the soup is really good kimchi. And then the fact that it was this kind of cut of the kimchi, which is gochujang, which is a very long strips of Napa cabbage, really allowed for slow fermentation. And so I always felt like that kimchi was so special because I never had kimchi like that anywhere. But also it's the part of like the kimchi that you have during kimjang when you make this fall harvest. So it kind of goes back to my earliest memories of making kimchi with my grandmother. So it had these kind of long strips of cabbage and then this fermented flavors that came from it, after kind of fermenting it in my luggage for like a day and a half and then putting it in the refrigerator like another week or two. And
Mhm.
I just felt like it was just such an amazing recipe. And also the fact that her restaurant she's had for now 30 over 30 years, but that recipe was also developed through all the ladies that had worked there, and not just our family recipe, but it was a symbol of just how the labor of love and just all the love that went into the food and kimchi making.
I feel like things have really changed over the last 30 years, as well as since 2009. Can you
Right.
speak a little bit about like, have you seen anything specifically like in terms of, I don't know, your own business with how times have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like in the last 5 years, there's just been much more just openness and access around different foods of the world, but especially Korean food and kimchi, popularity of Korean food through K-pop and other film. And there's just like such an openness to it. And I think it's just a really exciting time that I mean, I don't really have to explain what kimchi is to people anymore. Whereas, back in 2009, it was always like, what is that? But yeah, and really just trying to educate and inform where And I think that just the generation of curious eaters that are growing up now, like there's just less and less having to explain and more curiosity and around authenticity, around heritage, around health and around gut microbiome and just, really food as medicine too. I think that's all really all positive. So yeah, it's been really great journey to watch for sure, be part of.
Is there anything else that you would like people to know about kimchi or your story?
It can just be made so simply with such few ingredients. This kind of preservation was a way to keep food safe. So there's something really basic and foundational about that. And I think when I made my first batch of kimchi as an adult and as, before I was launching the business, it really gave me this connection. I felt like, I had the superpower to this connection to just like what it means to be a human being and to make your own food. And so to having that connection and especially also making it with your hands, because in Korea it's such a big deal, this idea of the sonmat, which means you make food with your hand and because it gives you this connection to your food, but also this idea of sonmat, which means that it's as if your hands can taste and really make delicious food. It's like making a salad, except you're using salt and other ingredients to kind of have a finished product and you wait for it. So
Mhm.
saying like if you can make a salad, you can make kimchi, and I really encourage anyone to make it because using your hands to like make this, no cooking involved. I mean, it's really fun, and when you start to see those bubbles and the fermentation and really taste the transformation of the flavors and everything that's happening, is really magical. And it's just so healthy for you too. So I would really just love to find a way to have more and more people make kimchi, enjoy kimchi, and have it be part of their daily lives.
Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And it was really interesting to hear both your personal story and then also hearing about, I feel like the method itself is like, that's what I'm taking away from our conversation. Is like, it's all
Yeah,
about the actual method and
right,
thinking about kimchi as a verb to me, that really resonated with me.
right. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it. It's so nice chatting with you.